Hi everybody and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Lysha and I'm the owner of Lysha Be Creative, and in today's tutorial I'm going to show you how to use the new handle mold from the Seal Magnolia, and you literally can add a handle to any style cup that you have on hand. So I'm going to show you how to use the mold, how I used the mold, and a couple alternatives for ways that you can use it if you choose to purchase this handle mold. And I'm also going to show you how to apply it. So let's go ahead and jump right into today's tutorial. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump right in. So this is the new handle mold from the Seal Magnolia company. It is meant to fit their tumbler specifically, but I'm actually not going to be using a tumbler that's from the Seal Magnolia. So we're going to be using regular epoxy. I'm going to use a fast set in order to be able to utilize this handle mold. So the first thing I'm going to do after taking the mold out of the package is I'm going to go ahead and spray the inside of my mold with just some 91% rubbing alcohol. So I don't want to use any sort of heat on this mold as far as like a lighter, like a barbecue lighter or a torch, because I don't want to melt the silicone, but I want to make sure that I minimize the amount of bubbles that I could possibly get inside of the mold. So a good way to do that is to just spray the inside of your mold with a little bit of 91% rubbing alcohol. That way when you pour your epoxy in, it'll kind of start to pop those bubbles on contact. So now I'm going to go ahead and stir up equal parts of my KS resin liquidy split. I am using the fast set here for this handle mold that I'm going to be doing for this tutorial, but because this is a clear silicone mold, you could certainly use UV resin in your mold under a UV lamp and be able to get the same exact results that I'm getting today with this fast set epoxy. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure to thoroughly mix my epoxy. I am really focusing here to really stir slowly and make sure that I don't get any unnecessary bubbles in my epoxy, to again make sure I don't end up with bubbles or holes inside of my handle when I go to demold it later. So taking the time in the beginning when I'm mixing my epoxy and stirring slowly and making sure that my epoxy doesn't have bubbles off the bat is really going to make sure that I don't end up with any dips or any, weird places in my handle that I might have some missing epoxy. So let's go ahead and get this kind of thoroughly stirred. I probably stirred for anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes is usually my stir time when I'm using my fast set epoxy. And then I also did already mix up the glitters that are going to be the handle color. So I have Pink Peony from Maisha Creations and then Hopeless Romantic. It's the same glitter colors that I used on the tumbler that we're going to be adding the handle to, so I just added equal parts of that, mixed that thoroughly together, and that is going to be my glitter mix on top of my epoxy to pour into the handled mold. I also will note that I did mix 30 mLs of epoxy, so I didn't think about measuring to see how much epoxy I might need for this handle. I knew I probably would have mixed more than I would need, but I would rather be on the safe side rather than not have enough epoxy. So I did end up mixing equal parts. I have 15 mLs of part A, 15 mLs of part B that I've mixed together, and then I'll just use the additional epoxy that I have left that's glittered, and I'll pour it into a couple molds that I already have off camera so I don't waste any of my epoxy. When I'm going to add the glitter, which you're going to see me do in just a moment here, the way that I like to add glitter is to add just enough glitter over the top of the epoxy so that I literally have just like a little bit of a mound right over top of there. And then I'm just going to thoroughly stir that in there to make sure that all of my epoxy is not only thoroughly mixed, but that it has equal amounts of the glitter thoroughly mixed within, so I don't have, again, any spots of my epoxy in my handle mold that might have just clear epoxy and not as much glitter. So we're going to get that thoroughly mixed, and then now it's going to be time to pour this into our mold. So I wasn't quite sure how this was going to work. So I thought the easiest way for me, since I didn't have like a pipette or like a syringe to use, was to try and hold open both sides as I was pouring in the epoxy pretty slow. So I kind of just slowly dripped the epoxy into one end of the mold. I was most worried about the very edges of the mold because I thought that if I tried to dump it into the center section that I would end up with some air pockets at either end. So I decided to start at both ends and then just let all of that meet in the center, so to speak. I probably used less than 10 mLs of epoxy all in all, and I ended up actually over pouring my mold, which you'll see when I demold it in the next clip. But I just filled that until it was completely full. And you want to make sure that you don't get any epoxy into like that slit that separates it. You want all the epoxy to kind of be flat under that. Otherwise, you're going to get like this weird lip that I got. So I just took my finger and very carefully pulled off with my gloved hand any epoxy that might have been over top of that mold there to make sure that I was, removing any epoxy that wasn't necessary and kind of overfilled in my mold. So this is a fast setting epoxy, and so this will be ready to go in about 4 to 5 hours. So I let that sit overnight before we're going to go ahead and demold this handle. So it's the next day now, and we're going to go ahead and demold this handle. So it was really easy to demold. I didn't have any issues whatsoever. You will note that it is a little bit dull, and that's okay because, again, epoxy is going to shine this up. But you'll also notice you can see where I over poured in my mold. So I have a little bit of like a weird lip here where the two edges of the silicone mold meet. And so the way that I'm just going to remedy this is just by sanding this off. So this was actually a perfect opportunity to use my Dremel tool, which I typically will utilize for like the top and bottom rims of my tumblers when I want to make sure to get that fine line of stainless steel at my rim. But this was actually perfect for this. So just sort of like a quick nail file tool just to kind of sand down that really bit of kind of extra lip that I had with the over pouring of my epoxy. And it kind of just worked out really well. So you could use a sanding block too. You don't have to use this if you don't have like a Dremel tool on hand. But I did find that this was much quicker using the Dremel tool versus trying to use a sanding block and trying to figure out that awkward grip of holding the little piece of the handle as well as holding the sanding block and getting everything evenly sort of sanded down. So I'm just going to continue to sand this. I'm making a huge mess here with sanding, which of course you guys know is not my favorite thing to do, but it needed to be done so that I had a really good and smooth handle that was, smoothly around all the way around. I did then go over the handle with some 91% rubbing alcohol just to brush off and get any of the debris off of the handle before I'm going to go ahead and get ready to apply this to my cup. So just take a paper towel, spray it down with some 91% rubbing alcohol, and then just wipe that thoroughly so that it's nice and cleaned off and doesn't have any of that sanding debris on it. So that's what the handle looks like so far. Now let's go ahead and get it applied. So now we have my tumbler, which I've already applied the zipper to, and we're going to go ahead and add the handle to this. So the one thing I will note and say to you is definitely measure twice, cut once kind of a situation. You want to make sure that the placement of your mold or your handle is where you want it to be. So everyone has their own preference. I wanted my handle a little bit closer to the top versus directly in the center of the cup, which I know some people kind of like. But then I did place the handle on the cup and tried to just mark it with a pen. That way I could make sure that the handle was going to be placed where I wanted it to be. So in the handle, you'll see here, right at the edges of the ends of the handle, there's like an indent or divot there, and that is exactly where I'm going to put just a bit of UV resin to kind of cover in that dip or hole before I go ahead and place it directly onto the cup. So be careful here. We want to make sure that we're placing it exactly where we've marked off, and then grab your UV lamp to be able to cure that for about 30 to 60 seconds to get it set. Once I've gotten that set with the initial coat of UV resin, you are going to see I'm going to go back and just touch up around the sealed areas of the handle edge to make sure that I get a nice strong seal on the edges where the handle mold, the handled piece meets the actual cup. So I wanted to make sure that I had a really strong adhesion there. That way I didn't have any issues with it potentially coming off at any point in time. Now we are going to epoxy over this, of course, but I wanted to make sure, again, I had that strong hold to begin with so that I didn't have any mishaps when I went to go apply my coats of epoxy over top of this cup. So I'm going to do another 60-second cure of this handle just around those edges, and then I can go ahead and pick this up. It should be pretty sturdy at this point after that bit of UV resin. And then we can go ahead and put this on the turner to epoxy this handle directly onto the cup so it looks like it was meant to be there the entire time. So let's go ahead and jump right over to the turner and let's epoxy this onto our cup. So I've mixed up some epoxy here, and we're going to do we would do 2 coats of epoxy over the handle. So I'm only going to show you me epoxying kind of one time over the handle, but in order to get a really strong adhesion, you're going to want to make sure that you epoxy twice over your handled area to make sure that you're not going to have any risk of it breaking should something happen to it, you know, a customer grip it too tightly, if you will, or whatever the case may be. So the thing that I like to do with my handled molds, or my handled cups rather, is I always kind of go around the entire tumbler with epoxy first before I focus on the handle. I want to make sure that my entire tumbler has the amount of epoxy that it needs for its coat that I'm working on before I stop the turner and focus solely on just the handle. By stopping my turner, I'm just going to make sure that my entire handle gets covered. I want to make sure that at those touch points or adhesion points to my cup that I have a nice good amount of epoxy there, but I also want to make sure that the epoxy is not pooling there. So that's why it's important to do at least 2 coats of epoxy. That way you really get a strong grip of your handle onto your cup, whatever cup style that you're using. Again, minimizing the risk of this handle kind of breaking off. So after I've gotten my epoxy on my tumbler, I'm going to go ahead and torch it. And so this is one of 2 coats, but literally go through and do your second final coat. And then here's a look at the final result. So this was a super quick, fun, and easy tutorial, but I wanted to show you guys about this handle mold because I absolutely love the option to be able to add a handle to any style cup I have. So I definitely will be adding some handles to some wine tumblers because who doesn't want a kind of, you know, handle mold or handle mug that's a wine cup. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. If you did, definitely be sure to give this video a huge thumbs up and subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you guys again in the next one. Bye.